couple weeks ago, New York Times reporting, Afghanistan, security companies using American money to fund insurgents and bribe Taliban. Now, if you have sons or daughters over in the Middle East, ladies and gentlemen, I think that you need to really reassess. And I think your support for what's going on over there. And I'm careful in how I word this because on the one hand, I understand people get very emotional about wars and about supporting the troops. But what we have to understand is that support for the troops doesn't mean support for the mission, necessarily. And some people get very, very obnoxious in their anti-war protesting, their anti-war statements, start going overboard at making the troops look villainous. And I think that plays into another dialectic. It goes too far the other way because the important thing is, ladies and gentlemen, that the victimization that's going on in foreign countries right now is being done by victims of a different sort, and that's our military. They themselves are victims. They're victim of lies. They're victim of deceptions. There's a lot of atrocities that go on in wars. There's a lot of horrendous things that happen, a lot of inexcusable behavior. And I don't want to excuse the behavior. It's very draconian and very nasty. It should never happen. Of course, you got to understand, too, that there's a lot of conditioning that happens with the troops. These people there's rallying that happens, mental gymnastics that they jump through. They get them in there, teach them that these people are not human. These people are dogs. These people, they dehumanize the enemy. There's conditioning that goes on to dehumanize the so-called enemy. And who's the enemy? Whoever the government says is the enemy. Whatever zone we're trying to take over, whatever area, whatever country, sovereign country, we're trying to overthrow. In the name of increasing profits of the military-industrial complex, stealing their mineral resources, and building our one-world global government. And that, in a nutshell, is what these wars are all about. So it's very profitable to have these wars extended out when you have those policymakers making the money off the wars. And here you have, once again, the United States funding both sides of the conflict. New York Times, June 7, 2010, for months. Reports have abounded here that the Afghan mercenaries who escort American and other NATO convoys through the Badlands have been bribing Taliban insurgents to let them pass. Then came a series of events last month that suggested an all-out collusion with the insurgents. After a pair of bloody confrontations with Afghan civilians, two of the biggest private security companies, Watan Risk Management and Compass Security, were banned from escorting NATO convoys on the highway between Kabul and Kandahar. The ban took effect on May 14th. At 10:30 a.m. that day, a NATO supply convoy rolling through the area came under attack. An Afghan driver and a soldier were killed, and a truck was overturned and burned. Within 2 weeks, with more than 1,000 trucks sitting stalled on the highway, the Afghan government granted Watan and Compass permission to resume. Watan's president, Rashid Popal, strongly denied any suggestion that his men either colluded with insurgents or orchestrated attacks to emphasize the need for their services. Executives with Compass Security did not respond to questions, but the episode and others like it has raised the suspicions of investigators here and in Washington, who are trying to track the tens of millions in taxpayer dollars paid to private security companies to move supplies to American and other NATO bases. Although the investigation is not complete, the officials suspect that at least some of these security companies, many of which have ties to top Afghan officials, are using American money to bribe the Taliban. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, they supposedly had elections over there. Supposedly, they installed this guy in office whose cousin or brother has ties to the Afghan drug trade. I mean, we can't have an honest election in this country. And we're expecting that Afghanistan's having honest elections? These are installed puppet leaders. One of them was a CIA asset. How convenient is that for us as we have the Afghan poppy trade continuing to flourish. Young people don't understand these things when they sign up. When recruiters come to high schools and they're trying to sucker these young kids into signing up for this stuff, they don't tell them this stuff. Nobody would sign up. It said, the episode and others like it has raised suspicions of investigators here in Afghanistan and in Washington who are trying to track tens of millions in taxpayer dollars paid to private security companies to move supplies to American and other NATO bases. Although the investigation is not complete, the officials suspect that at least some of these security companies, many of which have ties to top Afghan officials, which we've installed, my words, not theirs, are using American money to bribe the Taliban. The officials suspect that the security companies may also engage in fake fighting to increase the risk. Now listen to this, folks. The officials suspect that the security companies may also engage in fake fighting to increase the risk on the roads, and that they may sometimes stage attacks against competitors. So not only do we have these mercenary contractors over there fighting supposedly the Taliban, which we're funding with our tax dollars, but they're also evidently fighting each other. I mean, you have to laugh because it's so insane. They say the suspicions raise fundamental questions about the conduct of operations here, since the convoys and the supplies they deliver are the lifeblood of the war effort. Quote, we're funding both sides of the war, unquote, a NATO official in Kabul said. The official who spoke on the condition of anonymity, because the investigation was incomplete, said he believed millions of dollars were making their way to the Taliban. Here we see from the Washington Post, U.S. indirectly paying Afghan warlords as part of security contract. They said the U.S. military is funding a massive protection racket in Afghanistan, indirectly paying tens of millions of dollars to warlords, corrupt public officials, and the Taliban to ensure safe passage of its supply convoys throughout the countries, according to congressional investigators. So we have the Washington Post also reporting it from Press TV, which I believe is an Iranian news service. They say Taliban funded by U.S. taxes. The U.S. military has been giving tens of millions of American taxpayer dollars to warlords in Afghanistan through logistic firms in the war-torn country. I'm not going to read all of these articles, but I'm going to touch on them because I think it's important, ladies and gentlemen. Different sources, they're all saying the same thing. We are funding our own demise. Why are we there? Why are we in Afghanistan? I think that's what everybody needs to be demanding of their lawmakers and policymakers. We need to get out. And it may end up taking individuals making the decision to say, you know what, I'm not going back. And I realize there's consequences for going AWOL with the military. I realize there's consequences. But ladies and gentlemen, what if they had a war and nobody came? They can't have their wars if nobody's willing to go and fight. So let them handle it. Let these elitists send their sons and daughters off to fight and die. But that never happens. If they ever go to the war zones, they always have bodyguards. They're always escorted around. Moving along here. From Vanity Fair, we see America's war in Afghanistan, now officially longer than Vietnam. They say as of June 7th, the war in Afghanistan has lasted 104 months, surpassing Vietnam as the longest war in American history. American forces invaded Afghanistan in October of 2001. Kabul fell that November, and America's attention shifted to the war in Iraq. It wasn't until after the 2007 troop surge in Iraq and after that, the 2008 election, that America refocused its attention on Afghanistan, but our troops were there all along. In December of 2009, President Obama committed another 30,000 troops to the region in direct violation of one of his campaign promises, listeners. Proving once again there's no difference between the parties. He said he would bring the troops home. You could take that to the bank. And what does he do? He escalates the war. So presidents are puppets to the New World Order dictator leaderships that operate behind the scenes, in my thinking. They say critics and pundits have not been shy about comparing the conflict to the one in Vietnam. Gordon Goldstein's book, Lessons in Disaster, about President Kennedy and Johnson's national security decisions leading up to the Americanization of the Vietnam War, was circulated around the White House as they formulated their new strategy in Afghanistan. A touchstone of of Obama's Afghanistan strategy is the drawing down of troops coming home in the summer of 2011. By that time, the war will be 116 months old, a record we can only hope that will remain in the books for many years to come. Are we leaving, ladies and gentlemen? Are we ever leaving? Do we ever leave?